tried the other mic because it's more comfortable than this one. It's less unwieldy, but apparently it did not work very well at the service. So I switched back to this guy for now. It's much better, isn't it? You can totally, yeah, okay. Unfortunately, this is the one we're going to have to stick with. I think if I just had normally shaped ears, maybe this wouldn't be an issue. But apparently my ears are like no other human. Born of woman, as they say. So, anyway. Okay. I have skipped around a bit here to kind of drive us toward a conclusion alongside Richard Rohr. And so basically we're just going to be talking some about the prophet Isaiah this morning, and then we'll move from there directly into sort of the conclusion and concluding remarks and questions and input from you all about the prophets. Again, next week we'll begin Episcopal 101 in this same space. Oh, okay. I'm going to go downstairs really quickly and speak with the newcomers. So talk amongst yourselves for 5 minutes. I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. I thought about doing a Tony Robbins style, like run up from the back. Get everybody pumped up. Okay. So welcome to, again, the conclusion here. So we're gonna talk about Isaiah for a few minutes. Isaiah is often called the fifth gospel. Because Isaiah provides an outline, as it were, for the way that the New Testament writers certainly begin to understand Jesus and Jesus' ministry among them, as in many cases fulfilling the prophecies of Isaiah. There's a reason that we often find Isaiah in what season of the church year most prominently? Advent and Christmas, as we talk about the child to be born, the promise to come into the world. And so that's typically where we most often run into Isaiah. Also, this is just an aside, but I want you to think about, and maybe you have an answer for this, why typically we associate the word saint with, let's say, all the gospel writers, St. Matthew, St. Luke. Do you think of St. Isaiah? Do you think of St. Jeremiah? So it's interesting, in the Western church, the prophets don't get that honorific, but they always do in the Eastern church. So the iconography here is from the Antiochian Orthodox Church. The Old Testament prophets are always recognized as saints in the iconography and the traditions of Eastern Orthodoxy and of the other Eastern churches, which really should be the way. And I'm not 100% sure of why that tradition didn't evolve in the same way in the West as it did in the East. Anyway, just something to be noted, right? We would have no problem talking about St. Luke, but if you said St. Isaiah, people would be like, what? Yeah, it's a little odd. Okay. So some of what Rohr has to help us through Isaiah, the first thing is maybe one of the most sort of now well accepted and well recognized features of Isaiah, which is a long book. It has 66 chapters. But scholars now believe that Isaiah was the product of three different writer/groups, and really at three different times as well. So this is the great thing about literary criticism. It can help us as we look deeper into the language, and historical criticism as we look deeper at the history and the culture. Then we can really figure out approximately when these writers were writing. And obviously, if you get huge shifts in tone, mood, and even vocabulary and sentence structure, you know that you're probably dealing with a different author. So now we will typically talk about first Isaiah. And so this is chapters 1 through 39 of the book of Isaiah, as you would find it in the scriptures. We think that this person was probably writing somewhere between the Assyrian captivity and the Babylonian captivity. So between, again, these sort of two seminal moments in biblical Israel's history, the kingdom had split. Remember, the Assyrians conquer the northern kingdom, and the Babylonians later conquer the southern kingdom, known as Judah. And so, again, we know this largely by context, the context. So, first Isaiah, however, and Rohr talks about Isaiah as a whole as really the prototypical prophet, meaning the best, the one we pay the most attention to, right? The one who in this piece of writing, or these three pieces of writing combined, really gives us the clearest sense of what biblical prophecy is all about, what it's trying to accomplish, how it works, etc. So he sees again this sort of prophetic movement that we've been talking about. Now I feel like a weather person. So there's a movement here, it's coming down here, and we're going to get some snow this week. So, movement from anger at social injustice to lamentation. So here's a fascinating thing, for example, that Rohr points out about first Isaiah, is that the lamentation happens even for enemies of Israel like Moab. There is a movement then in Isaiah as a whole toward universalism. And what we mean by that in this specific context is going from the notion that only Israel is the chosen and blessed people of God, which really was never actually the teaching of the Old Testament, but just like religion happens to things, right? And sort of, right? But what the teaching was, even through Abraham, is that through Israel, all nations of the world would be blessed. So Israel becomes a conduit through which God will bless the entire world. Initially through the Torah, through the observance, through the temple, and then later for us Christians, ultimately and completely through Jesus Christ. And that universalism expands then, as we see in the biblical book of Acts. So that's what we mean by universalism. Isaiah is beginning to, you can see this evolution or this development in Old Testament history and prophecy from a notion of this sort of parochialism to maybe the covenant somehow, we don't know how, but maybe the covenant actually extends to all the world, all the peoples of the world. And so I'm going to share with you the contextual quotation here. Rohr just pulls one verse, but it's worth looking at the whole passage. And so this is, again, the voice of God speaking through the prophet Isaiah. And these are all places and people associated with this nation of Moab, the Moabites, who were enemies of Israel. And so I weep, as Jazer weeps for the vine of Sibmah. I water you with my tears, Heshbon and Elialah. For over your fruit and your vintage a cheer has been heard. Joy and gladness have vanished from the orchards. No more revelry in the vineyards. No more happy shouting. No more wine trodden out in the presses. The shouting all silenced. And so for Moab, my whole being quivers like lyre strings. My inmost self for Kir Hareseth. In vain may Moab go to wear himself out at high places, to come and pray in his temple. He can do nothing. This is quite striking. Tell me what you see here. Right? What do you see in terms of this universalism, this idea that even the enemies of God somehow are still part of God's divine love, justice, God's plan? I mean, this is a quite poetic way for the prophet to say, essentially, God is emotionally wrecked, as we might say, over the demise of Moab. God is not rejoicing over the demise of Israel's enemies in this case. God is actually expressing this profound empathy, we might say, in mourning and lamenting what is happening in Moab, along with Moab itself. This is really striking too, this final piece of the quotation, right? Because the notion is that, again, if you worship anything other than the God of Israel, that worship is pretty much vain and pointless. That's a theme that runs throughout the Old Testament. But here, notice again, it's not sort of in a judgmental tone that you say the worship is vain and pointless. It's really more in terms of a solidarity of sadness. In vain may Moab go to wear himself out at high places, to come and pray in his temple. He can do nothing. You know, this is not going to come to any fruition, but you get a sense that this is a point of lament for Isaiah. Not, again, a point of celebration, right? And condemnation of the nation. Second Isaiah, we think, again, takes place around the time of the Babylonian captivity itself. It constitutes chapters 40 through 55 of Isaiah, which is sometimes called the Book of Consolation. It contains the 4 servant songs, and the most well-known of these is Isaiah 53, which we will often encounter during Holy Week, where we talk about the suffering servant, the one who, by his stripes we will be healed, which is where the 80s hair metal Christian band Stryper got its name. I still have the album at home, To Hell with the Devil. This is not your thing. Yeah. That's right. Anyway, the 4 servant songs, what Rohr wants to point out about these in particular, again, is this language of vulnerability and powerlessness. Yeah.
Is this the first time that we see this kind of sorrowful tone enter the prophet?
In this specific way, right? Because it's tied into the immediate historical suffering that the Israelites are going through. But it is also tied to this powerful notion of hope that begins to enter the picture. So here is one example. I'm on page 122 of Rohr's book. This is from Isaiah 42. Here is the one I uphold, my chosen one in whom my soul delights. I have given him my spirit that he may bring true justice to the nations. He does not cry or shout aloud or make his voice heard in the streets. From the beginning I have been silent. I have kept quiet, held myself in check. I groan like a woman in labor. I suffocate. I stifle. Yeah. What do you hear? What do you hear in that servant song from Isaiah 42?
Powerful lament.
Yeah, a powerful lament. He does not cry or shout aloud or make his voice heard in the streets. This notion, I think, that Jesus then enacts, and certainly that folks interpret Jesus' work this way, that it comes to not the palaces, right? You sort of have this great contrast in the Christmas story between what's happening in the manger and then what Herod is concerned about. And you have this interesting sort of cross-play between the earthly king, who is now terrified of this baby who has been born into poverty in this manger, right? This huge contrast between those two worlds. So redemptive suffering, Rohr points out, rather than redemptive violence, pushing past, as we talked about last week, the language and the metaphor of risk and reward, that everything sort of balances out, pushing to this kind of universal image of God's grace and love for all. Then we come to 3rd Isaiah, chapters 56 through 66, so through the concluding chapters of the work. Again, now scholars believe that this is a whole school of prophets. So again, not one unitary author of 3rd Isaiah, but a school of prophets. And they used, as was very common in the ancient world, they used the name Isaiah because Isaiah already had this cachet, this popularity. People would pay attention. You see this sometimes with some of the letters of Paul as well, the ones that we think that Paul perhaps didn't write. They would still adopt the language and the persona of Paul, and that was not considered to be plagiarism. It was considered to be an homage, like you would be proud if somebody did that and quoted you in that way. Now, key, I think, in 3rd Isaiah for us and for Richard Rohr is that this is what Jesus quotes in his first public appearance in the synagogue. So in Luke 4, Jesus quotes Isaiah 61. He says, "The Spirit of God has been given to me. Yahweh has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the poor, to bind up hearts that are broken, to proclaim liberty to captives, freedom to those in prison, to proclaim the year of favor from the Lord." Remember, Jesus says this, right? He sits down. Everybody's looking at him. One of the great things that Rohr points out is that, and I never knew this before, but maybe one of the reasons that everybody is staring at Jesus is that he didn't finish the lines from Isaiah, which say, "To proclaim a day of vengeance from our God." Jesus leaves that part out. He sits down, everybody's looking at him. What is this guy talking about? Why did he not finish the portion of the prophet that we expected to hear? And then, of course, Jesus also says, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your midst." Right? And for this, they try to throw him off the cliff, as one does. I'm going to read it one more time, and I want to see if there's anything else that you notice about this proclamation of Isaiah from Jesus. "The Spirit of God has been given to me. Yahweh has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the poor, to bind up hearts that are broken, to proclaim liberty to captives, freedom to those in prison, to proclaim the year of favor from the Lord." This is a very pregnant passage. There's a lot happening here. Yahweh has anointed me. So Messiah means the anointed one. And Christ is the Greek translation of that. As I used to explain to my 8th graders, it's not Jesus' last name. Jesus Christ. So we have Yeshua, Jesus' given name. We have Christ, the title that refers to this messianic mission that God has given him specifically. So when Jesus says, today the scripture is fulfilled in your midst, I mean, there's question about it, but they think maybe he's actually saying that he is the anointed one. Maybe he's claiming to be the Messiah. And this is problematic. Then notice what Jesus says, again, quoting Isaiah. Good news to the poor, binding up hearts that are broken, liberty to captives, freedom to those in prison. Is this a spiritual or a physical salvation that Jesus is giving? It's a trick question. It's both. It's both. What is good news to the poor? Your debts are forgiven, right? What is a heart that is broken, right? This is something happening with all of us, right? This is a deep spiritual need that we all have. Liberty to captives, freedom to those in prison. I am guessing that even if the Episcopal Church, right, as funky and liberal as we are, made a policy proclamation that we wanted all prisoners to be released from prison, we would run into a little bit of resistance. But this idea that even the prisoners in prison, freedom, right, to the captives, liberty. And then Jesus concludes with this, to proclaim the year of favor from the Lord. That's the Jubilee year. Remember, every 50th year, we don't know that this was ever actually practiced in biblical Israel, but the ideal was that every 50th year, debts would be utterly and completely forgiven. It would be a complete societal reset. And so you will notice then in sort of solidarity with this, some churches and other organizations have tried to do some social justice work deliberately echoing this Jubilee concept by, for example, buying up medical debt and forgiving it. You can buy medical debt for pennies on the dollar. And then you can liberate people, right, who are literally never going to be able to pay off these debts, whose credit scores are just going down and down and down and down. So this is a kind of liberation, physical, spiritual, mental, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So this is Jesus, in other words, you have the prophecies from 2nd and 3rd Isaiah, but you also have the importance of Isaiah for Jesus' public proclamation. Again, one of the reasons that Isaiah is called the fifth gospel is because you get Jesus quoting this directly in his first public appearance. The rejected and the silenced ones, according to Rohr, always expose what the culture actually idealizes. The rejected and silenced ones always expose what the culture actually idealizes. In other words, we can say that we have certain ideals, but when we look at who is left out of the room, who is left out of the conversation, who is left out of society, then you can see what we actually hold up as good and true. And Isaiah really is quite, what's the word I'm looking for? Trenchant, poignant. You know, he digs, right? He really pokes and prods. He helps us to see these things. And then Rohr points out that Isaiah concludes with a universal hope in the restoration of God's kingdom, God's love for all. Which again is quite striking and quite an evolution, as he would say. I'll read just a little bit from the very last portion of Isaiah. By the way, if you have an extra $100 or so and you want a really fascinating version of the Hebrew Scriptures, I highly recommend this one. So this is by Robert Alter. He's developed his whole life, has been working in biblical literature. And this is just the prophets. Okay, so it's a 3-volume set. So you have the books of Moses, the prophets, and the history books. This is the typical Jewish 3-part division of the Old Testament. And they call it Tanakh because it is an acronym for what these 3 things stand for. but this is the book of the prophets. And you can see Alter has notes that are about half the page on every page, so helping with interpretation. He also translated the entire thing himself. So this is actually Alter's translation of the scriptures. Okay. Rejoice with Jerusalem, and all who love her exult in her. Be glad with her in gladness, all who mourn for her. For thus said the Lord, I am about to stretch out to her well-being like a river, and like a rushing brook the glory of nations. And your babes shall be born on the hip, and on knees they shall be dandled. As a man whose mother comforts him, so I myself will comfort you, and you shall be comforted in Jerusalem. And you shall see, and your heart shall rejoice, and your bones shall flourish like grass. And the Lord's hand shall be known to his servants, and he shall rage against his enemies. For look, the Lord shall come in fire, and like the whirlwind his chariots, to bring his anger to bear in fury, and his rebuke in flames of fire. For the Lord exacts justice. So you find even in the final chapter this combination of voices and themes that Rohr has been talking about. The drive toward the hope of the restoration, but also still hanging on to that idea that God is going to take care of the wicked and those who are outside of the circle. Okay, so in conclusion then, I'm jumping to, again, Rohr's final chapter. It's all about love, really. Okay, this is what he's been trying to argue throughout this entire book. He says first, we need to stop being surprised or shocked by reality and recognize that evil flourishes best when it is denied. Let's just start there for a second, right? Again, what do you think he's getting at here? What is he saying about us and about the prophets when he makes this claim? Okay, we have to toughen up about the world we live in. We have to look at it with clear eyes. Clear eyes. And I think that's, again, one of the points of the prophetic tradition in the scriptures that Rohr has been talking about. It's honesty. It's not trying to pretend or to conceal. It's not an easy kind of tut-tut consolation. Oh, it's okay, everything's going to be fine, right? The prophets get down into reality, and they reiterate to their audience, yes, things are really bad right now. They are. And so they're willing to acknowledge that. They're willing to look reality in the face and to name it as the evil that it is.
We don't like that, and people didn't like it then.
Yeah.
Right? That's
Yeah.
why they got mad at the prophets.
Yeah, absolutely, right? Why don't we like that, David?
Well, I think partly speaking correctly, we don't like to be told that we're doing something wrong or that,
Yeah. That we might be complicit. Yeah, for sure. And we talked about this, right, a couple of weeks ago, as Rohr talks about the prophets tell us in a collective way, right, rather than pointing out specific individuals. Evil flourishes best when it is denied. Where have we seen this show up? Evil flourishes best when it is denied. Evil relies on being considered rational, necessary, and expedient by otherwise good people. Here, I think, Rohr is deliberately echoing Thomas Merton. If you know the work of Thomas Merton, he was a Catholic monk, born in France, spent some time in the United States. He went to Columbia. He, I think, was a modern-day prophet in many ways. He died in Cambodia in the 1960s, right around the time that he was speaking out vociferously against the Vietnam War. If you're tempted to conspiracies, there are conspiracies out there that the FBI actually assassinated Thomas Merton. because he got electrocuted by a fan in his room in Cambodia. He was there for a worldwide congress of monks. Merton, as a Christian monk, thought that he actually had the most in common with Buddhist monks rather than other Christians often. So he spent a lot of time with Buddhist monks, and this is what he was doing when he died. Merton, as obviously anybody who was around in the 1930s and 40s, he wrote extensively on the horrors of Nazi Germany and on the Holocaust. He, in fact, was particularly attuned to the trial of Adolf Eichmann, put on trial in Jerusalem in the 1960s after the full horrors of the Holocaust had started to be unfolded. And this was one of Merton's main points. He said the Nazi regime was efficient, it was rational. The trains run on time. That was Mussolini, but still sort of the same idea. This was considered necessary. Merton talked a lot about language and the way that language was employed to mask the horrors of what was actually happening. So we have the final solution. It's just a solution to a problem. Again, we're just sitting down with a pencil and we're just working things out here, right? And so if we do X, Y, and Z, then the nation of Germany will be prosperous and great again. Everything will be fine. Trust me, right? And so Merton talks about this in an essay which is just beautiful and brilliant. What Merton says is, if this is what sanity is, none of us Christians have any right to be sane. We cannot be sane in a world that considers this to be sanity. And so he sort of pokes and prods and thinks about us in light of sort of that prophetic tradition, right? Or as we might say, make Christianity weird again. Flannery O'Connor talked about it as angular Christianity. We come at this from different angles, right? Because again, what we are confessing in our faith is something that is ultimately beyond rationality and understanding. Does that make any sense? This is a lot of, again, this is what I think Rohr is sort of drawing on, that tradition. Yes?
I wonder something what he's speaking about is that the dark and the light is in all of us.
Yeah, yeah,
Every one of us holds in the capacity
yeah,
for all that humanity has ever done.
yeah.
And which line do we be?
This is great. This is what Alexander Solzhenitsyn says in the Gulag Archipelago. He says the line between good and evil goes through every human heart.
And it's really hard to admit that, really.
Yeah,
It's easy to keep that philosophically in our heads.
right.
To really turn inward and to start doing that work inside of
Yeah.
ourselves to admit.
It reminds me often of conversations that we would have with our kids where we'd be talking about national or international politics. And the question they would have is, well, is that a good country or a bad country? Or talking about moving. Well, is that a good state or a bad state? And that's what we want to do because it is just so convenient. If we could just define the world that way, it would be so easy. Well, let's just, think about the good ones and condemn the bad ones. And, we all know that this is not how the world works. And we know not to listen to people who do that. Yeah, John, you were going to add something.
Yeah, along those same lines, there's a line in one of the Psalms, for you darkness and light are the same.
Yeah,
And that's not our perspective. We humbly dealt with that.
yeah,
But, and it's beyond good and evil.
Mm.
We don't get, he's approaching the problem as a mystic.
mm-hmm.
Everything hangs together.
Yeah,
But we have, we're looking for ethic or how to, what's
Yeah.
justice,
Yeah.
justice in that context.
right,
Anything goes, basically.
yeah,
God has worked it out in the end, so I can sleep well. I'm not worried.
yeah,
And so there's an apocalyptic that is still going on in Jesus'
Yes.
Rohr seems to be sanitizing
Yeah.
the prophets, but they never lose the sense that there's going to be a revenge here. I mean, they
Yeah.
soften it, but it comes back to bite them big time in the first century.
The
The Romans.
yeah, yeah,
Jesus and Paul were apocalyptics.
right.
And so I keep rushing up.
Yeah,
against
yeah.
That reality.
Sure.
And what Rohr is trying to use his mystical view
Yeah.
as an entree to the prophets.
Yeah,
That reality is an interpreted reality.
yeah,
It's not an objective reality. It's an interpreted reality, in my personal.
yeah. I mean, so there is certainly this tension, you know. Again, what we want, not only from the prophets, but from the Bible as a whole, is we just want it to be laid out in a rational and expedient manner, you know, in which we can understand in every given situation what it is that we're supposed to do. You know, when I was a teenager, that was very popular. People had rediscovered this book from the early 20th century called In His Steps by Protestant Charles Sheldon. And in that book, you know, the protagonist is encouraged to ask himself, what would Jesus do? So we had the bracelets, right? WWJD. Well, what would Jesus do? And at one level, it's a really good question. And at another level, it's a problematic question. Because there is a Christian ethic, but it emerges out of the contexts in which we are currently living. And it's not always clear immediately what we're supposed to do in any given situation. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is crystal clear. But it has to do with this notion, I would argue, of the church always listening to the Spirit and always being responsive to the Spirit and thinking about how we think about the Spirit of God moving within our current context. And if we didn't do that as the Episcopal Church, we would never have ordained women, right? If we didn't do that as the church, we never would have moved toward equality and justice for LGBTQ folk within our midst. And so, yeah, there's a danger, certainly, in sort of saying, this is always the way that things are. They always have been this way. They always will be this way. These are the lines, and if you just color in the lines, everything's going to be fine. Love, he says, is willing to accept and forgive a tragic sense of life. You know, this goes back to what he said in the preface. You know, as he said, I'm 80 years old now, and I have to forgive the world for what it is. And how it didn't live up to my expectations, right? That I thought by the time I was 80, maybe at least a few things would be fixed. And maybe, you know, I feel that even at 47. Because, you know, the years in which I sort of grew to consciousness politically and geopolitically were years of relative stability and peace in the 1990s. We had some stuff going on, right? But for the most part, it felt like, and I remember feeling as a teenager studying history, like this was the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama said. We fixed it. Everything's great. And then obviously 9/11, shattering, right? A shattering of this image and this illusion, as well as the understanding that, well, actually we were maybe not so stable and great in the 1990s after all. It just felt like we were. So, forgiving reality for being what it is. Rohr says, mature religion and good prophets make sure that this growth happens, this growth of understanding and forgiving reality. They liberate us to be like God, who is love, and reveal that God is not like us, which is the purified message of almost every prophet. Why is that potentially a consoling message? That God is not like us? Why is it a relief? You know, because I think the corollary of this is also good news for us, which is that we don't have to be God. So we are liberated from the notion that we have to be God because we accept that we're not ultimately in control. Sometimes even the things that we think we're in control of, we're not really in control. So that can be a liberating message. The idea that God is not like us can be a liberating message. Why? Yeah. Again, our imperfection, our tendencies, right, as individuals and as humanity toward revenge, reaction, violence. It is good that God is not like us in those ways. Conversely, right, I think the message also from the prophets is that God is not like us because God is so much more merciful and forgiving and kind and generous and loving than any of us is or ever will be. And so we can imagine ourselves into places where we have great examples in the church of sanctity, etc., but that God is always even beyond that. Yeah, John.
God is urgent with you, He's got all the time in the world.
Yeah.
And so we can,
Yeah.
as smart as I was.
Yeah.
I think that live and let live, it'll all work out in the end, this asceticism and all that
Mhm.
it's consoling.
Mhm.
Because but then that can dampen my sense of urgency to fix the world as I see it needs to be fixed.
Yeah.
Should we have more LGBT rights or should we wind it back to leave the beaver?
Yeah.
And I have to leave that question open. I can go with, I can what do you call it, parade and demonstrate from my own perspective what justice looks like, but I can never be objective, sure, and confident.
Yeah.
That is what God's will is. I can never be sure.
Yeah.
And so that's just
Yeah,
my
of course.
challenge to this.
Right.
I mean, and this is one last, Dietrich Bonhoeffer had one point of view of how to oppose the Nazis, and von Stauffenberg and the Rebel period had another assassinate to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And which one is the right? How
Yeah.
that fight is
Yeah.
bridged in the Christian.
Right.
So that's
Thanks, John. Yeah.
I think it's interesting that when I read through Scripture, I do see a sense of urgency. I see it repeated over and over again. I see, especially like coming from Amos and then through Isaiah and then like even in the teachings of Christ, you see this almost like zealotry coming out, especially in the earlier prophets. And I think it's this contradiction, like unity contradiction almost between this like long-term arc and this short-term urgency that we see. And I think when we're thinking about our own views on the world and kind of what is the correct way forward, do we choose forgiveness or do we like embody that kind of really sharply pointed zealotry where you have Amos preaching the destruction of all of the states in the Near East, you have Isaiah like also saying like a day of vengeance. And I think it's this contradiction between redemption and rectification, but also acceptance that like yes, there are things wrong, there have always been things wrong, and the way that we are not like God is that we have a difficult time really feeling the reality of both of those things together. Yes, there are things wrong. Yes, justice is something that has to happen. I mean, we are a religion that looks forward to a day where not a stone is left on stone. Like that is the day that we are looking forward to. And yet also, we have to acknowledge like redemption is possible for everybody. There is a right that we can look toward. And I think the way that we are not like God is that we really like things to be in parallel, to make sense, to work on a single unified mechanic, where it seems to me like the only real unified mechanic is the movement of everything in contradiction with itself, and that's what drives things forward.
Yeah.
And so we have a really hard time understanding that.
Sure. Yeah. We're pattern makers. Yeah. That's what we do. Yeah. Renee, you wanted to ask? Yeah.
So I look at this kind of big picture so that I can deal with things like the fact that I'm carrying And that is that we are perpetually children, and God is perpetually the mature adult.
Yeah.
And we think we grow with each generation, but
Yeah.
we stay perpetually children.
God is the grown-up in the room. Yeah.
Always will be.
Yeah. And always will be. Yeah.
We will never reach that height.
You certainly find throughout history that every moment, sort of historical moment, right, at which a particular people group, nation, culture, etc., sort of thought, we've reached the peak, we've sort of made it, we've reached this point of stability and justice and perfection, that something comes along very quickly to wreck that illusion. And again, this is what the prophets are saying, They would have said to me in the 1990s, oh, it's not all good. There are things happening in the world that you don't know about, but this is not black and white, And actually, there may be some tensions that are building, and maybe something is going to happen, right? So it's the prophets, again, sort of tearing down the illusion, right? And enabling us to face reality for what it really is. This is what Rohr leaves us with. My final conviction is that we cannot dismantle the violence we see in our world if we allow threats and promises to be the overarching frame of Christianity or any religious or secular creed. Again, basically, he is more or less saying that we can't allow ourselves to become that which we see in the world that is evil, that is wrong, that is violent, that is chaotic, that is unloving, right? And the moment that we begin to inhabit those characteristics, again, we're in trouble, right? And so the call, really, I think that Rohr is trying to leave us with, and John is very helpful to us in reminding us that Rohr is of this mystical bent, and this is where he's coming from, ultimately, is to say, step back, tell the truth, be loving, and let God be God. I mean, I think that's the final analysis. That's where Rohr wants to leave us. And some of us might be perfectly content with that, and some of us might not be. But I think that that's his shtick. Yeah. What do you think? Yeah, Ellen.
I'm struck by a tension here between what you just said, that is step back,
Mm-hmm.
let God be God,
Mm-hmm.
and the other side of it is go and be God's voice and God's
Mm-hmm.
hands and
Mm-hmm.
God's feet.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's not, I'm trouble with both of those.
Yes.
side by side.
Yes. Yeah. And this is the tension in our faith, which I think is God doesn't need our help, and yet God has chosen to use us, to work with us. These again, these broken vessels that we are, these jars of clay, as Paul says, God has chosen to use us in ways that are often really staggeringly beautiful, in the way that we're allowed to operate and to make a difference in the world around us. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you identify any modern prophets, particularly in the secular world?
Yeah. In the secular world specifically.
Well, yeah.
Like folks who don't claim to have any faith, tradition, or connection. I mean, I do think about someone like Greta Thunberg, right? I mean, who as a child sort of said, what seems to be the truth here, right? Here's the truth. I'm going to go tell as many people as possible what the truth is. If you don't know, Greta is the sort of climate change advocate who's been doing this since she was literally a child, right? That's somebody who comes to mind. And again, someone who at various points over these past, 10 or 15 years that she's been doing this has been ignored, reviled, horrible threats of violence, imprisoned most recently, right? all of these things. So yeah, that's to me a good example of a modern day secular prophet. Again, in that sense in which this is someone just saying, I just want us to tell the truth. That's all I want us to do, is just look at the truth and see what's actually happening in the world around us. Yeah.
One of the challenges that I experience with this, and I think this is me trying to be in this paradox, is like, you know, I do scholarly work in education, so I'm like, aha, white Christian nationalism. That's the truth of our problem.
Yeah.
And then I realized that I'm falling in to the same problem.
Mm-hmm.
That it's a fundamentalism of its own. It's
Yeah.
a new fundamentalism
Yeah.
of its own. And I don't know what to say about it except to say I don't think that going around
Yeah.
denouncing white Christian nationalism in education is a good path forward. This has been more and more my feeling.
It is a great struggle. It's a great tension. Yeah, it reminds me of what Rohr says early on, which is that the prophets come out of that specific tradition. And so, I mean, I think that the people who are going to be the most powerful and evocative and effective people to speak are people who are within that tradition itself. And then say, what's happening here? This is not good, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. But it's hard. It's hard. And again, I think Rohr is at one level just trying to get us to accept the fact that there are all of these tensions and that this is not an easy thing to do. What is natural to us is enemy making, right? What is natural to us is division and classification. The way that our human brain has evolved is to recognize patterns. You know, that's what we do best. And there's this, God is not like us. Yeah, yeah,
And he also says we are like God. And
yeah,
so,
yeah.
from a mystical perspective,
Mhm.
that the mind is not the way to get through something like this.
Right,
And in the West particularly,
Yeah.
we're so conditioned to use the mind.
yeah,
You can't see the holy in someone who you think is awful or their ideas are awful, but use your mind and always drive into your heart to see the soul light in someone.
It's a great point. And we'll end on this. It reminds me of what Jesus says about a particular kind of demon that he encounters in the Gospel of Mark. He says, this kind can only come out with prayer. You know, prayer is the thing, I think, that enables us to be like God and to see the world from God's perspective. And at one level, that's such a easy answer, but prayer is not easy, but it's ultimately necessary for us if we're to have any hope of working our way through this. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
The West has been, Christianity, yet Christianity is our prayer, especially
Yeah.
our tradition.
Yes. Yeah.
And then the other balance of that is to go in silence and not only to speak to God, but to ask, but to listen.
Mm-hmm.
God, what would you have me do? What would
Yeah.
you have me say?
Yeah.
It's remarkable that answers actually really come.
Yeah. And this is the heart of mysticism and something that I think, even if we're not all mystics, I think it's something that we recognize about our faith, which is that any time in which we identify that there are two alternatives, you know, the mystic comes along and says, well, actually, you know, we've got to get past this binary dualistic thinking. We've got to get to seeing God as one, this oneness. Well, thank you all for what has been a really, really fun and interesting and provocative series. Let me close us with a prayer. The Lord be with you. Almighty God, thank you for giving us minds to think, hearts to feel, and hands to serve. We pray that as we continue to encounter all of these numerous challenges, Lord, in our own lives and in the world around us, that you would comfort us with a powerful sense of your presence, that you would open our hearts and our ears, help us to listen to the suffering of those around us. Give us wisdom, we pray, both individually and corporately, that we will best discern how to act and what it is that you want us to do and to be as the face and the hands of Christ in the world. In your name we pray. Amen. All right. Thanks again. See you next year. Be sure to sign my yearbook on the way out.